Hi guys. I'll wait a couple of minutes to see if anyone else comes. Okay, hi guys. Is there anyone there?
Merhaba hocam.
Merhaba. Okay, so I hope everyone's okay. I know that for those of you not in philosophy, one of our students died last week, Omar. So if any of you are friends of his, I offer condolences, and if anyone needs to talk about it, I'm always around. Yeah, horrible news. Okay. Today, we're going to talk about this finish off talking about the Susan Carey article. And then tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the article on Bayesianism, Bayesian fundamentalism. And then after that, we're going to talk about the predictive mind paper. So they're the kind of three things we've got left this semester. And I think the paper by Carey sort of is one thing is it's the second half of this semester. I had to cut a few things because we sort of run out of time. I was a bit too ambitious when I prepared the syllabus, but that's fine. This paper sort of fits in between Milligan and the Bayesian thing, because on the one hand, she wants to defend at least part of her view, I think is compatible with Milligan's view of concepts. So there's a particular type of concept that I think Carey and Milligan can agree about. But also I think one of the things she wants to do is to attack a certain type of position that the Bayesian is committed to. So last time we talked about two of her main commitments in the book, of which this is a sort of précis, are the idea that, first of all, there are radical discontinuities in development. So in development, infants develop new conceptual repertoires, and an adult human being possesses concepts and ways of thinking that are not expressible in terms of the infant's concepts. So that she's committed to the possibility of real conceptual novelty. Yeah. So this type of discontinuity she wants to commit herself to is a commitment to the idea of genuine novelty, conceptual novelty in development. And I think tied to this is she wants to reject the idea that's kind of common amongst, I think, many people in cognitive science, especially those who have particular types of computational views, that all learning is hypothesis testing. Yeah, so this is a view that you find amongst the Bayesians, that all learning is basically hypothesis testing. And this is tied to views about novelty, because if you think that all learning is hypothesis testing, then you're going to think that the hypothesis space has to be, in some sense, definable before the learning. So before you go about collecting data, collecting evidence, you already have to have a capacity to represent the possibilities. And then, according to this idea that learning is hypothesis testing, then learning consists in deciding which hypothesis is most likely to be true. So in order to have a model like this, the hypotheses, you have to represent them before learning. And I think the thing about conceptual novelty, one of the things about conceptual novelty is that it suggests that part of learning involves being able to represent hypotheses that you weren't able to represent before. So there's a type of learning that is not merely hypothesis testing. And this is something that when we look at the Bayesian stuff, this we'll see. Okay, where's my paper? So last time I was talking a little bit about the introduction. Oh, by the way, I started grading the exams. I know this has been a difficult semester and everything's messed up. So if a bunch of people didn't submit midterm exams, I mean, I'm quite relaxed. If people didn't submit, but if you've got friends who aren't here who didn't submit, who could submit, then I'm open for late submissions. But I'm starting to grade now. I've got a little bit of the way through. I'll try and finish it over the weekend, but having a baby makes things sort of difficult. And this semester, the midterms ended up being really late. Yeah. Okay. So this is where we were last time. So Carey, who here? So what I want to talk about mainly today are her accounts of conceptual or representational novelty, and she offers 3 different ways in which organisms can acquire new representations. And who's read the article? So who? I know it's towards the end of the semester, but have people read this one? I mean, for tomorrow, I think the Bayesian stuff and the predictive mind stuff, I really want you to read that. Has anyone read this? Am I going to have to force feed you the content of this paper? I mean, it's a bit boring if no one's read it, because we can't really have discussions. I can just tell you some stuff. No one? So there's a sort of silence. Okay, so let me just tell you. So she basically argues in her book that there are 3 ways in which we can acquire new representations. Yeah, and this is starting on page of the article on page 423. So first of all, she thinks that there's a relatively easy route to new representational primitives. Yeah, so these are new representational primitives, and these are domain-specific learning mechanisms. And I think in this section, it's important that I'm not sharing. Yeah, in this section, I think it's important that she's saying new representational primitives. In the next section, she's going to talk about new conceptual primitives. So these new representational primitives are the sort of things that she thinks are not necessarily conceptual. They don't involve new concepts. They're relatively easy. They're sort of representations that many animals are going to have, even quite simple organisms. Yeah, and so the examples she gives here are domain-specific learning mechanisms. So she says the literatures of psychology and ethology have described hundreds of domain-specific learning mechanisms that simply compute new representations from input having arisen in the course of natural selection just to do that. So who's from psychology here? Anyone from psychology? Can anyone think of any sort of domain-specific learning mechanisms that can give rise to new representational primitives? Who's a psychology student here? Are there any psychology students? Is anyone listening? People have got the cameras off, so yeah. Oh, let's have I'm here. Okay, Atesh is there, but yeah, but you're from philosophy. So domain-specific learning mechanisms. Any sort of thoughts? Well, has anyone heard of imprinting? Yeah, so you got Konrad Lorenz, who wandered around and was followed by all of the geese. So there's a sort of learning mechanism where the first object that the goose sees that is, when after they're born, basically they represent as mother. Yeah, and they create this representation, this is mummy. Yeah, and so the geese sort of attach to the first living being, and they follow it around. This is their kind of primary caregiver. It turns out, yeah, the mechanism is specified for imprinting. So you can either it's the first thing that moves around in an animate way. So one thing's about mummy is alive, and living things move in a way that non-living things don't. So young ducklings and geese will imprint on the first thing that's moving around in an animate way, or they can imprint on something that looks like a goose. So you can have a cuddly toy goose that isn't moving around, and the duckling will imprint on that. So one sort of example she gives is this sort of imprinting. The example she spends most time working on, developing, talking about, is about indigo buntings. So indigo buntings are a small type of bird, and these are birds that navigate, that fly vast distances. So in the summer they're in the north, in the winter they're in the south. And of course, in order to fly south, the birds have to know which direction to fly. Yeah. So how do the birds decide which direction to fly? How do they get a sort of natural? How do they learn to navigate? How do they learn to find out what direction is north, which direction is south? And we know that they do it well. Anyone, any suggestions about how they might do this? So how they do it is that they learn which part of the night sky indicates north. So today we have the North Star. Do people know about the North Star? You heard about the North Star? Now, how do they know which star is the North Star? Yeah, this is the question. Like, one view would be that they are just born with a sort of inner representation of all the stars, and they're born with an innate, this map is labeled, and the star we call the North Star is labeled as the North Star. So one view would be that the sort of mechanism is innate, yeah, that these birds are born with a sort of map of the night sky with one of the stars marked as the North Star. Now, what's problematic with this view? Why is it obvious that why is it kind of quite clear that it's probably not innate? Well, the problem is that the Earth tilts back and forth on its axis. So you've got the axis of rotation of the Earth, that's north, but that it doesn't remain fixed. Yeah. So which star indicates north changes over time. Yeah. And over evolutionary time, so the Earth tilts back and forth on its axis. So what part of the night sky indicates north changes radically on a 30,000 year cycle. Yeah. So what bit of the sky, what star indicates north isn't something that's fixed over evolutionary time. It changes. Yeah. So instead of having a sort of evolutionarily implanted map, the birds have to learn through experience which star is north. And there's a sort of simple way of working out which star is north, which is the north is the top of the axis of spin. So think about the night sky as the Earth spins. The stars are seen as spinning around a point, and the point in space around which the stars spin, that's north. Now that's basically, and that's how it seems the birds learn which direction is north. And you know how they prove this? This is the learning mechanism. Well, this guy, Stephen Emlen, basically brought up birds, chicks, in a planetarium. A planetarium is where you have stars projected on the ceiling. And they basically kind of made them rotate around a different point in the sky, in the night sky. And the birds that were brought up in that planetarium, instead of heading north, they headed towards the point in the sky that was the center of rotation in the planetarium. So all the birds brought up in the planetarium had no sense of direction, and basically they all died because they went in the wrong direction. You know, absolutely horrible. So, I mean, yeah. So you know, sometime in the future, the North Star will be Vega, not Polaris. But it's unlikely that an innate representation of Polaris as the North Star was created by natural selection. Yep. And this guy, Stephen Emlen, discovered the learning mechanism through which indigo's bunting create the representation of north that will play such a crucial role. The learning device that achieves this analyzes the center of rotation of the night sky and stores the configuration of the stars that can allow the bird to recognize the position of north from a static sighting. Yeah. So they did all sorts of experiments with birds in a planetarium. When they were brought up as chicks, they were given a fake night sky. Then you could set up the night sky, and they would fly in the direction that they'd learned. You might think some birds, it seems, don't use stars. Some birds seem to use the magnetic fields of the Earth in their migration. But now, so here, yeah, and these sort of learning mechanisms seem to be ubiquitous. These are sort of things that we find in all sorts of animals, with all sorts of very specific types of learning capacities. And they seem to be kind of supported by dedicated machinery that atrophies after work is done. So that you have a certain critical period in which to learn this stuff. And then if you don't learn it in that time, it's impossible to learn. Yeah, so you have something in the early development of the brain that you have these sort of learning. Yeah, so if a bird's prevented from seeing the night sky as a nestling, no amount of exposure to the rotating night sky later in life allows the bird to identify north, and the bird perishes. So this seems to be a type of learning that isn't really hypothesis testing. Yeah, so if we think this seems to be a good count, these sort of domain-specific learning mechanisms seem to be very good counterexamples to the idea that all learning is hypothesis testing. Because there's no hypothesis being tested, it's just a mechanism. It does seem to be genuine learning. I'm a bit skeptical as to whether, I'm a bit skeptical about whether these sort of cases really are good examples, though, of new representations. Because you might think that at birth, that the bunting has a representation of north, and what they learn though is which direction is north from the stars. Yeah, so I mean, you might think, do they learn the concept north, or is it just they just learn which direction is north? Yeah, you might think to begin with they start off with the kind of any direction could be north, and then it's sort of narrowed down. So I think these cases offer very good sort of counterexamples to the claim that all learning is hypothesis testing. So I don't think it's possible to cash this out in terms of hypothesis testing, because you have you just have a imprinting. There's no you don't update on the basis of new evidence, it seems to me. But it's not obvious that you really have what is the genuine new representation? You've got a representation of the night sky and a representation of north. And you might think, well, what you learn is you learn which bit of the night sky is north. So is it a new representation, or is it just learning to apply a representation? So you might think that the representation of north is in some sense innate. So the bird is born knowing that there's a particular direction they need to fly, but they don't know which direction that is. That's what they learn. Yeah, but the direction I ought to fly, at a certain time of year. So you might think that they have a representation that when the kind of temperature gets to a certain level, then there's a certain direction they should fly. And then what they learn is what direction that is in the night sky. It's not obvious to me that they've really acquired a new representation. Now, I don't know. Does anyone else have that worry? Maybe I'm just too finicky here. Yeah. Okay, that's the first thing. So that's quite fun. Secondly, she thinks there's a second way of acquiring new representations, and these are the sort of concepts that we were looking at in Milligan. Yeah, so these are going to be things like what Milligan calls subject concepts. So we can acquire through learning the concepts of kind. So we have, and this is and these are new conceptual primitives. Yeah, these aren't, and I think in some sense they're not domain specific. So we have a kind of a sort of domain fairly general capacity to come up with concepts of kinds that we didn't have before. And the kind concepts we acquire are going to depend about aren't going to depend about what's going on in our head entirely. The sort of kind concepts we have are going to depend upon the type of world in which we live. Yeah. So, for example, as human beings, we live in a world with tables and chairs and fridges. These are all kind concepts. They're all artifacts. And these are concepts that are acquired. These are concepts that, you know, our ancestors living in the jungle wouldn't have had these concepts. Yeah. So we've got a capacity to learn kind concepts. And yeah, so this is a kind of yeah, so these are respond to inputs sometimes by simply creating new conceptual primitives. And what makes these primitives conceptual is that they enter or can enter into representations with propositional format. So they're the sort of representations that can play a role in judgment and participate in the full productivity of language and causal inference. So these are what makes them conceptual is that they're able to play a role in language, they're able to play a role in causal inference. Yeah, so now, and these sort of learning mechanisms don't necessarily involve hypothesis testing. So I take it we have this object kind learning mechanism. She talks about Bloch, his sort of theory. He's not best known for it, but this is her husband, so she's kind of giving him a plug in the book. But this is these sort of object kind learning mechanisms. These are the sort of things that Milligan was arguing for. That we have a capacity to create. We can encounter an individual, and if it's important for us, we can, on that sort of one encounter, we can form a concept or a mental file of the individual or of the kind. Yeah. And so she says this learning mechanism is triggered by encountering a novel object with non-arbitrary structure. So these objects have as the sort of language that Milligan talked about is that these are things of which there is rich inductive potential. Yeah. Yeah. So this non-arbitrary structure, I think she is going to kind of correspond to what Milligan was calling rich inductive potential. Yeah, so encountering an individual with one or more of these properties triggers establishing a new representational primitive that can be glossed as same basic level kind as that object. And this appealed to basic level kinds. I think once again, this is something that Milligan appeals to. So, you know, that you have mammals and you have, I don't know, Ankara cats. These aren't basic level. It turns out that the basic level kind is going to be cat, not animal or mammal or Angora cat. And there's a bunch of criteria that one can give as to what makes a kind a basic level kind. So people interested empirically in categorization have developed this notion of a basic level kind and think that this is when we form our first concepts are of basic level kinds, not others. One part of evidence for this has got to do with language learning. So if any of you are from linguistics, I don't know if you've looked at this about language learning, but yeah, you know, that children learn the concept cat and dog before they learn the concept animal, or at least in terms of language, they start using words like cat and dog before. Yeah. Yeah, so they have a kind of these sort of basic level kinds. Yeah. So this is yeah. So and one thing is that like Milligan, Carey is a sort of externalist about these sort of kind concepts. So the content of the new concept depends upon the referent. Yeah, so what the concept refers to doesn't depend on something inside the head, but depends on the way the world is. Yeah, so it depends what sort of kinds, basic kinds there are out there in nature. So we're able to create a kind of concept on a single encounter, and the extension of the concept is determined by the way the world is, not what's going on in the head. This is what's known as sort of externalism about conceptual content. I think most of the people in philosophy of language and interested in concepts kind of buy into such a view today. But she thinks that the content depends upon the reference, but it also depends upon the conceptual role provided by the basic level kind schema. Yeah, so that she thinks the content has these two sides. Now, this is something she's defended earlier on. We talked a bit about last time about how she has this sort of dual content view, that both inferential role and reference play this. Yeah, so this is basically her view, that if you were in the classes about Milligan, I think her view here is very close to Milligan's view. Yeah. So she says these writers discuss this mechanism as a natural kind learning mechanism. But she thinks that these sort of learning mechanisms isn't just for natural kinds. So natural kinds are, you know, like species in nature. But there's all sorts of kinds that aren't natural, but where we can create kind concepts. Yeah. So she says, I believe the domain of this mechanism is object kind representation, as opposed to object properties, individual objects, etc. And what's really central here is that kind representations are inductively deep. Yeah, so this is the idea we saw when we were looking at Milligan, that these sort of concepts, substance concepts apply. What a substance is substances are things with rich inductive potential. Yeah, kinds of things with rich inductive potential. You meet a cat, you see the cat eats milk, drinks milk. From seeing a single cat drinking milk, you kind of can make the inference that, oh, next time I see a cat, maybe it will drink milk. Yeah, so on a single encounter with a member of a kind, you make inferences about how the kind, how other members of the kind will act in the future. Yeah, so you're able to make inferences about future behavior based upon a single encounter with a member of the kind. And once again, this seems to be a type of learning. So remember, her central claims is we think there's conceptual novelty. So here I think we really do have an account of how we can have concepts, you know, that the concept of a fridge is the concept of a computer is a kind of, or of a laptop. These are concepts that we have, perfectly good concepts. But these concepts weren't possible until laptops came into existence. So these are concepts that our ancestors just couldn't have possessed. Yeah, and they can't be defined in terms of prior concepts. Yeah, we have a class of objects that have sort of similarities. There are yeah, what concepts are possible, what kind concepts are possible depends upon what kinds there are in the world. This is basically the idea. So the first thing is these sort of mechanisms for forming kind concepts to involve real novelty, conceptual novelty. So this mechanism creates new primitives, not definable in terms of other manifest concepts, and thus increases the expressive power of the conceptual system. Yeah. Until Europeans went to Australia, none of us in Europe could have had the concept of a kangaroo. The concept kangaroo is not definable in terms of antecedently available primitives using the combinatorial machinery of logic. Yeah. Before creating this concept, one could not think thoughts about kangaroos. Just as before analyzing the center of rotation of the night sky and storing a representation of north, an indigo bunting could not set or guide a course of flight towards or away from north. I'm not sure about this second. I think the case of kangaroo is stronger. So the claim is before Australia was discovered by Europeans, Europeans could not have the concept kangaroo. You can only get the concept kangaroo through encountering kangaroos. That's basically the idea. I mean, you might think some people are going to disagree with this. You might think, if you're a Leibnizian, you might think God has all the concepts of all the possible kinds in his head before creation, and then decides which one to create. So kind of God had the concept kangaroo before kangaroos. I think that if you're a kind of Aristotelian, yeah, pre-Darwinian, maybe a view like that makes sense. That species have a definition, they have an essence, and maybe one can understand the essence prior to the creation of the individual. Yeah, that the essence, in some sense, precedes the existence. Yeah, so the concept kangaroo existed prior to kangaroos. Yeah, because the concept kangaroo is understood in terms of a definition. This would be the kind of Aristotelian view of species, biological species. That for each species, there's a sort of definition. But I take it like today, I think no one buys into this view of what species are. If we think of species biologically in terms of populations that are capable of interbreeding, then being a member of the same species, the concept of the species can't exist prior to the existence of the species. That we can only form the concepts on encountering a member of the species, which creates a problem for divine creation. Now, how much time have we got? Well, there are some problems with this view. So we have the idea of same kind as that object. But why do we form the concept of a kind rather than the concept of yeah, so let me read this. But Ray asks, why are not kinds such as objects, animals, agents, eastern grey kangaroos, kangardiles? This is going to be kangaroos. This is going to be like Goodman's group paradox, undetached kangaroo parts, or an infinite other kinds, possible glosses of same kind as that object, rather than the kind kangaroo. Why does the learner not form a concept of a particular individual, Oscar, rather than a kind? So you come across an individual and you form a concept. Why form a concept? What makes it a concept of the kind rather than a concept of the individual, rather than the concept, like you see a cat, you see an Angora cat, and you form the concept X, a child. Why do you form the concept cat? What makes it the fact that you form the concept cat rather than the concept cat part, undetached cat part, or the concept Angora cat, or the concept of a cat living in Istanbul, an Istanbul cat? Yeah. So what determines the scope of the extension? And I take it that Carey thinks, well, the answer to this is empirical. This is not something that we can answer a priori. But our mechanisms, the learning mechanisms are such that they latch onto basic level kind concepts. Yeah, so she said it's a discovery that there is a basic level in kind concepts, and it is a discovery that basic level kinds are privileged in kind concept learning. Yeah, and I take it that the basic level stuff, I think, is going to be tied to the idea that these learning mechanisms do involve some stuff about conceptual role. Yeah, but basically there is a problem here, I think, for any such account of concepts, and I think Milligan's account of substance concepts suffers from the same sort of worries. How you know that you label something, you come up, but what makes it a concept of cats rather than a concept of mammals? Yeah, and the answer is appealing to something like basic levels, and then the question is, well, how does this basic level stuff work? And then the sort of answer, which isn't very satisfying to a philosopher, but the answer is, well, we just need to go and read a whole bunch of empirical work on basic level kind concepts. Yeah, and the question about exactly how these mechanisms work is going to turn out to be an empirical question. And the sort of answer is that kind representations embody constraints derived from causal functional analysis. Yeah, and so this is all going to be messy and empirical. Okay, so and it's going to turn out that you've got different types of mechanisms. So you've got one mechanism for learning kinds, but you've got another mechanism for having concepts of individuals. Yeah. So when we meet an individual cat, we might, and let's suppose this cat is called Lulu. That was the name of my first cat when I was a kid. So when you first meet this cat Lulu, it's possible that you form two concepts simultaneously. You form the concept Lulu and the concept cat. Yeah, and the sort of claim is there's going to be two quite distinct mechanisms for forming the concepts of individuals and forming the concepts of kinds, given the fact that on a single encounter we can form both concepts. You know, like someone may meet you and think, form the well, yeah. I mean, so one thing is that when we're thinking about people, like, the people can fall under many different kinds. So, you know, like, you can be a human being, you can be an individual, you can be a Turk, you can be a woman. Yeah. And so one problem is that individuals can fall under many different kinds at the same time. So I think there's going to be a problem here in explaining exactly how the mechanism is supposed to work for individuals that can fall under more than one kind. But this is all gets messy and empirical. So she says the child can form a concept of a particular individual, even a newly encountered kangaroo. And there is a dedicated learning mechanism for concepts of individuals as well as for basic level kinds. Yeah. And if you're interested, there's a sort of literature that explains how these learning mechanisms are supposed to differ. And once cognitive science has discovered the constraints under which actual learning devices operate, one can explore their possible outputs. So here there's a sort of division of labor where the philosophers have thought about externalism and the principle of learning mechanisms, but then the details of how these individual mechanisms are supposed to work is an empirical scientific question. Okay, so yeah, so she talked about these two types of conceptual learning. And then she says a little bit about this dual factor theory of representations. And this is the idea that she wants to combine, for philosophers, she wants to combine basically internalism and externalism. She wants to define a view of conceptual content that says both the reference and the conceptual role play an essential role in defining or giving an account of the meaning of a concept. Yeah, and I think the existence of these innate conceptual roles, so there's going to be an innate conceptual role for object kinds in general, is going to, I think, play a role in explaining how different concept types are going to have different extensions. So it's going to turn out that the way I think of this, so I quite like the talk of mental files. And this is a sort of way of thinking about things that is in the same camp as Carey and Milligan. But you might think that we have sort of file templates. And the file templates are going to involve things like we might think of as a bit more like definitions. So we might, and these may be hardwired. So we may distinguish between inanimate objects, living beings, and individuals. And then we have different templates for each of these types of concepts. Yeah, so I think this is sort of her position. That there's a probably a kind of finite, and she's quite into nativism. She's quite into innate structures. So you might think there's a finite set of concept types. Yeah. So we have agents, we have individuals, we have kinds, and each of these types has a certain type of conceptual role and a dedicated learning mechanism. But the concepts of the individuals of that type are learned. Yeah, they're not innate. Yeah, this is the sort of view. Okay, so that's two of the things in Carey about novelty, and both of them are examples of things where we have, first of all, we have representational novelty. We have new representations that aren't definable in terms of priorly existing representations. And secondly, we have examples of learning that isn't a matter of hypothesis testing. The third type of learning is the most complicated. And tomorrow, I was going to start off with the Bayesian stuff, but I think tomorrow I'm going to start class tomorrow talking about what she calls Quinean bootstrapping. So tomorrow we'll start the class talking about Quinean bootstrapping, the third way of acquiring new concepts. So this is page 429 to 431. And the example she gives is of number cognition. So how we move from the infant's understanding of numbers to an adult understanding of numbers. And she thinks there's this radical conceptual change that can't be explained in terms of innate learning mechanisms. So the learning adult numbers involves a type of conceptual novelty we haven't seen before. And she labels this Quinean bootstrapping. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about how this is supposed to work. I've got to run because my wife now needs to teach her class. So I'll see you tomorrow in class. Bye-bye.